Hey, it's Roger, creator of the Azure Sandbox, and in our last video, we covered the architecture of the new VNet on-prem configuration. So let's pick up in this video and actually provision this new configuration. So kind of high level, this configuration includes some resources for a simulated on-premises network. So we create a new virtual network. We create a VPN gateway, site-to-site VPN connection up to our cloud network from that simulated on-premises network. And it includes a Windows Server virtual machine that's pre-configured with Active Directory domain services and a new domain called myonprem.local. It also includes a Windows Server machine that we can use as a jump box. So pretty much those are the resources that get provisioned in the simulated on-premises network. And then in the cloud network, which is represented by the Azure Sandbox, we're going to drop a new site-to-site VPN gateway into the virtual WAN hub, and we're going to configure that for connectivity to the on-premises network. And we're also going to create and configure a DNS private resolver, which we're going to use for bidirectional DNS queries against private DNS zones in both places, in both our on-premises network and in Azure, including private zones that are associated with private endpoints for services like Azure Files, Azure SQL Database, and Azure MySQL Flexible Server. So before you try to apply this configuration, you need to have the vWAN configuration provisioned first. So if you haven't done that yet, please go do that. It also helps to have some of the other optional configurations provisioned for things like SQL Server VMs and Azure MySQL databases so that you can do all the smoke testing associated with testing that bidirectional network connectivity. So let's go ahead and get started here with a deployment. So I'm going to fire up VS Code and we'll do a deployment. All right, so this new configuration sits here in this extras folder, and it's here in Terraform Azure RM VNet on-prem. So let's go ahead and move down into that directory in our terminal. And first thing I want to do, as with all of my configurations, we need to create that environment variable with our secret for our service principal so that Terraform can authenticate. And I'll have to remind myself to change this after I publish this video. And now that we've set up our secret, we can run Bootstrap. All right, so we've grabbed some configuration from these three other configurations. So from VNet Shared, VNet App, and vWAN. So we're able to get all that information from previous configurations that we've provisioned. So this first input is for the address space that we're going to use for our simulated on-premises network. And these next ones are all going to be subnets. We're going to carve that address space up into individual subnets. So that first one is for the gateway. This one is for our domain controller and DNS server. And then this one is for where we are going to provision our jump box. We also need to set the IP address for the DNS server. Since it's not deployed yet, we have to kind of configure that in advance, and that'll just be the first private IP address in that that ADDS subnet, that 10.1 subnet. 0 to 3 are reserved for Azure. And then we also need to, in advance, configure the IP address that's going to get used for the inbound endpoint for our DNS private resolver. and that's a subnet that's sitting up in VNet shared, a miscellaneous subnet that we're going to use for the DNS private resolver. So that's going to be inbound endpoints for the DNS private resolver. So that's going to be the first IP address in that subnet. Here's the domain name we're going to use to configure our domain controller, myonprem.local. So that's a new domain. It's different from the mysandbox.local domain that we're using up in Azure Sandbox. And this is the name of our domain controller / DNS server. And this will be the name for our jump box. And at that point, we have all the input we need, and Bootstrap goes off, grabs some secrets from Key Vault, and starts configuring Azure Automation desired state configuration by provisioning some variables and then uploading and compiling configurations for our 2 virtual machines. And this first one is the configuration for our domain controller called on-prem domain config. So that compilation process has kicked off, and we'll jump back in when Bootstrap moves on. Okay, the configuration for our domain controller was successfully compiled, and now Bootstrap will move on and compile the configuration for our jump box. So I'll jump back in when that's complete. Okay, our jump box configuration compiled successfully, and now we're going to move on and cover. Okay, our Bootstrap completed successfully. Both of our configurations were compiled successfully, and a terraform.tfrs file was created by Bootstrap, which has all of our configurable properties for our configuration. So it kind of echoes it out to the screen here, but you can see that a file was added here by Bootstrap. So at this point, we can go ahead and initialize our configuration. So that'll pull down the Terraform providers that are used, including Azure RM, which is the Azure provider, and then random for generating random names. So you can see it's created a Terraform directory and a lock file for those providers. So now what I will do is I will validate that this configuration is syntactically correct, which it is. And we can go ahead and create a plan which will tell us if we were to apply this configuration, what resources would actually get provisioned. So we can learn from the plan that if we apply this configuration, there'll be 24 resources added, 0 changed, and 0 to destroy. So that is what I expect since we are applying this configuration for the first time. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's do a Terraform apply. All right, so Terraform's off and running, provisioning all those resources. There's quite a few different 24 separate resources getting provisioned. 2 of them take quite some time, including the site-to-site VPN gateway that gets provisioned in the vWAN hub, and then also the virtual network gateway, which gets provisioned in the on-premises network. Those take roughly 30 minutes or so to provision. So I will jump back in when any significant things happen, but we'll pause the video during some of the time that we're waiting for those resources to provision. So you can see we've already provisioned a lot of the networking resources required on the on-premises side, and we're also working on provisioning the DNS private resolver in Azure that's going to be used for that bidirectional DNS private zone name resolution. You can see that the gateways are also provisioning, and we've started provisioning our domain controller virtual machine. That shouldn't take long for the VM to provision. You can see that domain controller VM was created, but now it's being configured. So that process can take quite some time. So at this point, we're kind of into a lot of the long running configurations, which include the two gateways that I mentioned, both on the on-premises side and the cloud side, and then the VMs. All right, our domain controller VM was provisioned and configured successfully, and that will free up the Jumpbox VM to get provisioned and configured, since the Jumpbox has to join that domain. There's that dependency. So it only takes a couple minutes for the compute to get provisioned, but then the configuration kicks in, and that takes quite a bit longer. Meanwhile, our two gateways are still chugging away on the on-premises side and in the vWAN hub and on the cloud side in the Sandbox. And again, those take roughly 30 minutes each to provision. So I'll jump back in when something interesting happens, but we'll pause the video while we're waiting. And here you can see the jump box is now getting configured. All right. One of the it looks like the VPN gateway in the vWAN hub was the first to finish provisioning, and some of the related resources that had dependencies on that are also now free to provision up for configuring connections. And we're still waiting on the gateway on the on-premises side, the VPN gateway on the on-premises side to provision, as well as the Windows jump box. All right, the virtual network gateway on the on-premises side has finished configuring as well, and you can see some of the related resources being provisioned to establish connectivity between the on-premises network and the cloud network using a site-to-site VPN. And it looks like the last resource to complete provisioning once those connections are created is the Windows jump box. That should be wrapping up here shortly as well. All right, the VPN connection from on-prem to cloud was provisioned successfully. And we're still waiting for the VPN connection from cloud to on-prem to finish provisioning, as well as the jump box. All right, so the cloud to on-prem VPN connection has provisioned successfully as well. So the last remaining resource to finish up is the Windows jump box. And there we are. The Windows jump box also provisioned successfully. So we have 24 resources that were successfully provisioned. That's exactly what we were expecting. And we can go out and interrogate that state file to see the names of those resources or the resource IDs by doing a Terraform state list. So here's a list of the 24 resources that were provisioned. So we're all set. We had no errors during the provisioning process. And in the next video, we will pick up with the smoke testing. Thanks, everybody.